The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon and darkness. Officer Kyle Martinez adjusted his radio for the third time in 10 minutes, the static crackling through the humid evening air like broken glass. His uniform still felt foreign against his skin, the weight of his service weapon unfamiliar on his hip. 24 years old, fresh out of the academy, and this was his first real patrol shift in the inner city. "You're making me nervous with all that fidgeting," said Officer Rebecca Chen, his training partner. She leaned against their patrol car, watching Kyle with the patient expression of someone who'd seen dozens of rookies come and go. Her 15 years on the force showed in the way she carried herself, relaxed but alert, hands never straying far from her belt. "Sorry," Kyle muttered, forcing his hands to still. "Just want to be ready." "Ready for what?" "We're standing outside Murphy's Liquor watching drunks stumble home. This isn't exactly high-stakes police work." She smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "Look, kid, I know they filled your head with all kinds of scenarios at the academy. Shootouts, high-speed chases, hostage situations. But 90% of this job is just showing up and being visible. Community policing, making people feel safe." Kyle nodded, but his stomach still churned with nervous energy. He'd dreamed of this moment since he was 12, watching his Uncle Marcus pin on his badge each morning. Uncle Marcus had been a cop for 30 years before retiring, and his stories had painted the job as noble, heroic work, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, standing between order and chaos. The radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, we have a domestic disturbance at 1425 Maple Street. Respond when available." Rebecca reached for the radio. "Unit 47 responding. ETA 5 minutes. She looked at Kyle. "See? Domestic dispute. Probably neighbors arguing about a dog or something." But before they could move toward their car, the liquor store's door burst open with such violence that the security bell clanged like an alarm. A man stumbled out, moving with the jerky, unpredictable gait of someone deep in the grip of something more than alcohol. He was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look through everything they saw. In his right hand, he gripped a chrome-plated pistol. "Oh, Jesus," Rebecca whispered, her hand instantly moving to her weapon. "Kyle, get behind the car. Now!" But Kyle couldn't move. The training scenarios had been clean, controlled environments with instructors barking orders and predetermined outcomes. This was chaos. Real chaos. The man with the gun was shouting something incoherent, waving the weapon in wild arcs. People on the sidewalk scattered, some running into traffic, others diving behind parked cars. A woman screamed. A child began crying. "Kyle!" Rebecca's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Draw your weapon!" Kyle's hand moved to his holster, but it felt like it was moving through thick water. Everything seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. The gunman's face came into sharp focus, unshaven, tracks of tears mixing with rain, eyes that had seen too much. Kyle recognized something in those eyes. Desperation, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. The gunman's gaze locked with Kyle's across the 20 feet of rain-slicked pavement. For a moment, everything else faded away. The screaming, the radio chatter, even Rebecca's urgent commands. It was just Kyle and this broken man with a gun, connected by a moment of mutual terror. Kyle's weapon was halfway out of its holster when his hand began to shake. Not the slight tremor of nerves, but the violent shaking of complete system failure. His training had covered this scenario dozens of times, but standing here in the rain with real bullets in a real gun pointed at real people, Kyle felt his mind go completely blank. The gunman raised his weapon, and Kyle knew with crystal clarity that he was about to watch someone die. Maybe multiple someones, maybe himself. His finger found the trigger of his own weapon, but his hands shook so badly he couldn't aim. 24 years of life, 4 years of college, 6 months of academy training, and in the moment that mattered most, he was frozen. That's when he heard the voice. Center mass. The words came from the shadows of the alley beside the liquor store, spoken in a tone so calm and steady that they cut through the chaos like a blade. Kyle's head snapped toward the sound, and he saw an old man sitting against the brick wall near an overflowing dumpster. The man was soaked through, his gray hair plastered against his skull, but his eyes were clear and focused. He wasn't looking at Kyle. He was looking at the gunman. Center mass, the old man repeated, his voice carrying despite its low volume. Breathe. Steady. Wait for your moment. Something in that voice, the authority, the certainty, triggered something in Kyle's training. His hands stopped shaking. His breathing slowed. He could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, as he raised his weapon and found his stance. The gunman was still shouting, still waving his pistol, but Kyle no longer saw chaos. He saw the situation exactly as it was. A man in crisis, 30 feet away, with innocent people in the potential line of fire. "Drop the weapon!" Kyle's voice surprised him with its strength. "Drop it now!" The gunman paused, his wild eyes focusing on Kyle for the first time. The pistol wavered in his grip. "I see you," Kyle continued, his voice steady. "I see that you're hurting. But this isn't the way. Put the gun down and we can talk." Behind him, Kyle could hear Rebecca calling for backup, but he kept his focus on the gunman. The man's face was a mask of anguish, and Kyle realized he was crying. "She's gone," the gunman said, his voice breaking. 23 years, and she's just gone. "I'm sorry," Kyle said, and meant it. "I'm sorry for your loss. But this won't bring her back. Put the gun down and let us help you." The gunman looked at the weapon in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Then he looked at Kyle, and something in his expression shifted. The desperate rage was still there, but underneath it, Kyle saw something else. Relief. The relief of someone who had been drowning and suddenly felt solid ground beneath his feet. "Okay," the gunman whispered. "Okay." He set the pistol on the ground and stepped away from it, his hands raised. Kyle kept his weapon trained on the man until backup arrived 30 seconds later. 2 additional patrol cars screeched to a halt, and uniformed officers quickly secured the scene. The gunman, whose name Kyle learned later, was Robert Martinez, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 2 weeks earlier, was taken into custody without incident. As the scene wound down, Kyle found himself shaking again, but this time it was the aftermath of adrenaline rather than fear. Rebecca clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work, rookie. You talked him down like a veteran." Kyle nodded, but he was looking toward the alley where the old man had been sitting. The space was empty now, nothing but shadows and garbage. He walked over to where the man had been, looking for any sign of his presence. All he found was a dry patch on the concrete where someone had been sitting, protected from the rain by an overhanging fire escape. "You okay?" Rebecca asked, following him. "There was a guy here," Kyle said. An old homeless man. He helped me. Rebecca looked around the empty alley. I didn't see anyone. He was right here. He told me to aim for center mass, reminded me to breathe. Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. Huh. Well, whoever he was, he knew what he was talking about. You handled that perfectly. Back at the station, Kyle found himself unable to concentrate on the paperwork. The incident report seemed inadequate to capture what had really happened out there. How could he explain that moment of complete paralysis, followed by the mysterious voice that had somehow unlocked his training? How could he describe the way the old man's words had cut through his panic like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog? Sergeant Maria Santos appeared at his desk, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen too many rookie cops come close to their breaking point. Heard you had some excitement on your first shift, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Yes, ma'am. Could have gone better. Could have gone a lot worse. Chen says you talked down an armed suspect without firing a shot. That's textbook police work. Kyle looked up from his paperwork. Sergeant, can I ask you something? Shoot. Have you ever heard of a homeless man in that area? Older guy, gray hair, seems to know police procedures? Santos paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Why do you ask? He was there tonight, in the alley. He said something that helped me focus. What did he say? Center mass. Told me to breathe, wait for my moment. Santos set down her coffee cup and stared at Kyle for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos. She found what she was looking for and turned the screen toward Kyle. The photo showed a man in dress blues, perhaps 20 years younger than the figure Kyle had seen in the alley, but the eyes were unmistakable. The same clear, steady gaze, the same authority in his bearing. Frank Delaney, Santos said, 30-year veteran, Medal of Valor recipient, best cop I ever worked with. Kyle studied the photo. What happened to him? His wife died about 2 years ago. Cancer. Frank took it hard, harder than anyone expected. He'd been talking about retirement anyway, but after Maria passed, he just disappeared, turned in his badge and gun one day, and walked out. I haven't seen him since. And you think this was him? Santos took back her phone and stared at the photo for a moment. Frank always said that in a crisis, you fall back on your training. Center mass was his mantra. He taught it to every rookie he partnered with over the years. So he's been living on the streets? I don't know where he's been living. I've looked for him, believe me. We all have. But Frank doesn't want to be found. She paused. The thing about Frank is he never could resist helping a cop in trouble, even after everything he's been through. Kyle absorbed this information slowly. Should I try to find him? You can try. But like I said, Frank Delaney doesn't want to be found. If he helped you tonight, it's because he saw something in you that reminded him of why he became a cop in the first place. Consider it a gift. The next day, Kyle returned to the alley beside Murphy's Liquor. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the gaps between buildings. He brought a thermos of coffee, a sandwich, and a warm coat he'd bought at a thrift store. He also brought a notebook in case the old man, Frank, wanted to talk. Kyle sat in the same spot where he'd seen Frank the night before, waiting. An hour passed, then two. A few people walked by, but none paid attention to the young cop sitting quietly in an alley. As the sun began to set, Kyle realized Frank wasn't coming back. Maybe he'd never come back. Kyle left the coffee and sandwich where Frank had been sitting, along with a note he'd written on a piece of paper torn from his notebook. "You saved my life last night. You reminded me why I became a cop. Thank you. Officer K. Martinez." He returned to the alley every day for a week, always bringing something: food, coffee, a book, a newspaper. He never saw Frank again, but sometimes the items he'd left would be gone the next day. Kyle chose to believe that meant Frank was still out there, still surviving, still occasionally helping cops who needed it. Years later, when Kyle had made detective and was training rookies of his own, he would tell them about that first night on patrol, about the moment when everything he'd learned seemed to evaporate, leaving him frozen and useless, and about the voice from the shadows that had reminded him of his training just when he needed it most. "Center mass," he would tell them. But that's not just about shooting. It's about finding your center when everything around you is chaos. It's about remembering that underneath all the fear and adrenaline, you're still a cop. You're still someone who chose to stand between order and chaos, between the innocent and those who would harm them. And some of his trainees would nod and take notes. Others would look at him like he was telling them a ghost story. Maybe he was. But Kyle knew that somewhere in the city, Frank Delaney was still out there, still carrying the weight of 30 years of service, still ready to help a cop in need. And every time Kyle heard those two words in his mind, center mass, he remembered that being a police officer wasn't just about the badge or the gun or the authority. It was about being ready to stand up when others needed you to stand up, even when you weren't sure you could, even when you were afraid, especially when you were afraid. Kyle never forgot that lesson, and he never stopped looking for Frank in the faces of the homeless men he encountered during his patrols. He never found him, but he never stopped hoping that somewhere out there, Frank had found some measure of peace. And on quiet nights, when the city rain fell like tears on the pavement, Kyle would sometimes hear those words again, carried on the wind like a prayer. Center mass. Breathe. Wait for your moment. It was enough to remind him why he'd become a cop in the first place. It was enough to help him keep going.